A woman finally sits down at the end of the night after spending the entire day responding to messages, responding to work, responding to other people's needs, responding to problems, and responding to interruptions, responding emotionally. And what's strange is that from the outside, the day may have looked completely normal, productive even. But internally, there's a level of exhaustion that feels disproportionate to what technically happened. Not physical exhaustion, a different kind. The kind that comes from constantly being psychologically available. And I think a lot of women in midlife quietly live inside this state far more often than they realize. Because many women were conditioned very early to become emotionally responsive to everyone around them, to notice needs, anticipate problems, maintain harmony, stay accommodating, stay dependable, stay emotionally aware of everyone else in the room. And over time, that level of constant emotional monitoring becomes automatic. So automatic that many people no longer recognize how much energy it consumes. The nervous system remains outwardly oriented almost all day long, scanning, adjusting, managing, accommodating, and eventually people begin wondering why they feel emotionally depleted despite technically handling everything. But when you really look at it, constantly functioning as emotional support infrastructure for everyone around you requires enormous amounts of cognitive and nervous system energy, especially when little reciprocal restoration exists. There's actually research in psychology around emotional labor, which describes the mental and emotional effort involved in regulating emotions, managing interpersonal dynamics, and maintaining emotional responsiveness. And while emotional labor exists in many forms, women often carry disproportionate amounts of invisible emotional management inside families, workplaces, relationships, and caregiving roles. Remembering birthdays, monitoring moods, keeping communication flowing, preventing conflict, checking on people, maintaining family logistics, absorbing emotional tension, being the reliable one. The difficult part is that much of this labor is socially normalized, so people rarely stop to question whether the level of constant emotional accessibility they maintain is actually sustainable. And what's interesting about that is the nervous system often adapts to chronic emotional responsibility by becoming hyper-attuned to external needs, meaning your attention automatically moves outward before it moves inward. You notice everyone else first, what they need, what they might feel, what could go wrong, whether anyone is upset, whether everyone is okay. And over time, people can become so externally focused that they lose regular contact with their own internal signals, not intentionally, but gradually, because survival adaptation often rewards self-monitoring and external awareness, especially for women who learned early that being helpful, emotionally available, or easy to manage created safety, approval, or stability. The nervous system remembers those patterns, and eventually helpfulness can stop being a choice and start becoming an automatic identity structure. That's important to understand because many women who feel emotionally exhausted are not necessarily doing too little self-care. They may simply be living with almost no psychological boundary between themselves and everyone else's demands. And when that continues long enough, emotional depletion starts becoming cumulative, not dramatic, cumulative. A constant low-grade drain. You answer one more text when you're already mentally tired. You say yes even though your body wants rest. You continue listening when emotionally overloaded. You absorb another person's stress while privately suppressing your own. Individually, those moments seem small, but over years, the nervous system keeps absorbing the cost. And eventually, many women begin experiencing symptoms they don't immediately connect to emotional overextension. Irritability, brain fog, difficulty concentrating, emotional numbness, overstimulation, resentment, difficulty relaxing, feeling disconnected from joy, feeling mentally on all the time. And I honestly think that many women quietly reach a point where they no longer feel fully present inside their own lives because so much of their energy has been allocated towards maintaining everyone else's stability. The nervous system never fully powers down. Even during rest, you're technically sitting still, but mentally still monitoring, remembering, anticipating, still emotionally tracking everyone around you. And what's interesting about chronic emotional responsibility is that people often become extremely skilled at functioning while simultaneously feeling deeply depleted. From the outside, they appear highly capable. But internally, the nervous system is running on very little actual restoration. That's one reason so many women say things like, I don't even know what I need anymore. Because when attention remains externally focused long enough, self-awareness becomes harder to access consistently. Not because identity disappears, but because there's been very little uninterrupted attention directed inward. And I think midlife often becomes the stage where that imbalance finally becomes impossible to ignore. The body starts resisting. The nervous system becomes less tolerant of chronic overextension. People become more sensitive to overstimulation and less willing to maintain exhausting dynamics, less willing to continuously override themselves. And honestly, I don't think that represents selfishness. I think it represents psychological exhaustion finally becoming visible, because eventually the nervous system reaches a point where constant emotional availability no longer feels sustainable. And what's difficult is many women immediately feel guilt when they begin pulling back. Guilt for needing space, guilt for saying no, guilt for protecting energy, guilt for no longer wanting to absorb everyone else's emotions all the time. But the nervous system interprets lack of boundaries as lack of recovery. And that matters because recovery is not only physical, it's psychological, emotional, and cognitive. Human beings require periods where they are not constantly emotionally responsible for other people. And a lot of people underestimate how emotionally regulating boundaries actually are. Not rigid walls, healthy pacing, healthy differentiation. The ability to remain compassionate without becoming psychologically consumed by everyone else's needs. That's a skill many women were never taught, especially women conditioned to equate worth with usefulness. Because when usefulness becomes identity, boundaries can feel emotionally unsafe. The nervous system begins associating self-protection with rejection, conflict, guilt, or disconnection. So people continue overextending themselves long after depletion appears. And over time, emotional exhaustion begins affecting the entire quality of life. Creativity narrows, your presence narrows, patience narrows. Even joy becomes harder to access because the nervous system spends so much time in management mode. I've noticed this in my own life at times too. There are moments where I suddenly realize I've spent entire stretches of time emotionally tracking everyone else while barely checking in with myself. And what's interesting is how quickly the nervous system normalizes that imbalance. You stop noticing the tension because it becomes familiar. But familiar does not always mean healthy. And honestly, I think many women are beginning to quietly question whether being endlessly available is actually the healthiest way to live. Not because they care less, but because they're recognizing that constant emotional overextension slowly disconnects people from themselves. That realization changes things because eventually people stop asking, how do I keep giving more? And start asking, what would it look like to support others without abandoning myself in the process? That question creates a much healthier direction because emotional maturity is not becoming emotionally unavailable. It's learning how to stay connected to yourself while remaining connected to others. And that requires boundaries. pacing, recovery, intentional energy management, not from a productivity standpoint, from a nervous system standpoint. For some people, this may look like reducing how accessible they remain digitally, not answering every message immediately, not feeling obligated to emotionally process every conversation in real time, not continuously exposing themselves to emotionally draining interactions without recovery. For others, it may mean becoming more honest about limit, recognizing when the body needs rest, when the mind needs quiet, when overstimulation has exceeded capacity. And what's interesting about boundaries is they often feel uncomfortable initially because the nervous system has to recalibrate, especially if someone spent decades prioritizing external harmony over internal steadiness. But over time, healthier boundaries create something many women have not consistently experienced in years: psychological breathing room, not isolation, not selfishness, just enough internal space to actually hear yourself again, to notice your own needs, your own energy, your own emotional state, your own preferences. Because eventually there comes a point where people realize they do not want to spend the second half of life functioning exclusively as emotional support systems for everyone else. They want reciprocity, present relationships that feel nourishing instead of chronically extractive. They want nervous system steadiness, attention that belongs to them sometimes, lives where care flows both directions. And I think that realization represents growth, not failure, because protecting your energy is not the same thing as becoming cold. It's recognizing that emotional sustainability matters, that your nervous system matters, that your internal life deserves attention too. So maybe instead of asking, how do I keep holding everything together for everyone? A more supportive question might be, what would change if I allowed my own nervous system to matter too? Because sometimes healing begins there, not through dramatic transformation, but through gradually recognizing that your role in life was never meant to be permanent emotional overextension. And over time, that awareness changes the way you move through relationships, responsibilities, and even your relationship with yourself. Less depleted, less emotionally fragmented, more intentional, more reciprocal, more fully connected to your own life again. If this episode resonated with you, make sure you subscribe to Clarity Reset. And if you want additional tools to help you create more emotionally sustainable rhythms and reconnect with yourself more consistently, I'll leave the Clarity Reset resources below. And until next time, remember that caring for yourself is not a betrayal of others. Sometimes it's the very thing that finally allows care to become sustainable.